I mean, we're kind of, ignoring what happened this week where Putin basically is putting nukes back on the table. Now, I'm not saying that's likely to happen, but I don't know how this market gets a lot better with the risk of World War III hanging over our heads. I mean, who wants to enter the market with that on the table? And
by the way, the nukes, just to be clear, you can hear certain military commanders speaking publicly about this, but in the Russian military playbooks, there is specifically defined actions that can lead to tactical nuclear weapon use in the field. There's no direct indication that these things are going to be used right away, but as Sachs says, there's like this weird turning up the volume happening on, hey, maybe we're getting closer to a point where if Putin is having tactical failure in this conflict, there's more weaponry he can use that has greater impact. And unfortunately, there are these tactical nukes in his arsenal. And, a guy that maybe has a certain psychology that has, as our friends have said, his back against the wall. He's not a person who in his career or in his history has ever acquiesced to defeat.
Alex Karp was on CNBC. He was really, really sharp and concise about this, which is that, in the West, when leaders fail in their objectives, they just get elected out and somebody else takes their place.
Yeah.
But for somebody like Putin, there is nobody to take his place because it's a very zero-sum situation. And so his actions will, as a result, also be zero-sum. And I think folks...
He's never acquiesced in his life. And
yeah, we've never really kind of we don't understand well what zero-sum decision-making looks like when it comes to stuff like this.
He needs the golden bridge, right? You're going to give him the golden bridge out.
But I'll just say two things. One is that I think it's been made pretty clear that both India and China will not stand beside Russia if they do something like this. And I think that is important because they still are the two biggest purchasers of Russian oil. And so I think that matters a lot because you're talking about a lot of revenue that would go away. And then the second is, I mentioned this last week, and this may sound dumb to some of you, but don't sleep on the Russian mothers. And what happened this week...
Oh, you're 100% right on that.
What happened this week was really interesting, which is that he calls up all these reservists. These reservists are now coming from the major cities of Russia. You're starting to see protests. You're starting to see young people saying, I don't want to do this.
Yep.
And who's that really activating? It's activating the moms.
Yep.
And so don't sleep on the Russian moms.
300 people are being drafted, to basically go fight. And I actually think...
But David's right. Oh, sorry, go ahead.
The question I have for you is, do you think, and I know you don't agree with this, but do you think the strategy is to back him into a corner and then have this rhetoric spike to then force a resolution? I know it's a dangerous strategy. It's a crazy chess move. But do you think that's actually what the West is thinking?
I see no evidence that we have any intentions of seeking a diplomatic off-ramp. I see no evidence that they're looking to give him a golden bridge, like you said.
Then do you think they're trying to break him and have regime change?
I think Biden stated the policy, which is this man cannot remain in power. I think he blurted out the truth of his policy. This is a regime change policy. That's what they're going for. They are backing him into a corner.
Jacob, I thought that you were right this whole time, which is we're going to build a golden bridge. We're going to find a way to egress this guy. And I'm now sort of in the David camp, which is I think that the stated strategy of the Western alliance is essentially to cause him to make such a categorically catastrophic mistake so as to become a pariah, so as to either get overthrown or something. So I do think that on balance, the risk is now for things to escalate, maybe not in quantity, and I'll use this word in the wrong way, but quote unquote, the intensity of it. So I think David's right. It's a lot of pressure to the economy and to
it's a high risk strategy. High risk strategy.
It is a high risk strategy. We got a good thing going over here. I don't see the need for all this risk. So look, and part of the
risk would be the reward. What would you see the reward if Putin was removed? Oh my Lord.
Well, it depends who replaces him. What if we get a hardliner? You got to remember, Putin's taken out all the liberal reformers. All that's left are hardliners. So I know there's moms protesting in the streets, but he's also under intense pressure from his right wing. He's got hawks on his side who basically have been criticizing him for making this a special limited military operation instead of a war. They're like, why did you try to do this with 200,000 troops? We should have gone in heavy with 1 million.
Oh, is that right? There's criticism internally of him.
There was a New York Times article about this. He has his own, military hardliners in his security state.
His hawks.
So he's not just under pressure from peaceniks who are protesting in the streets. He's also under pressure from hardliners in his own government who think he's been too soft.
Yeah. It's a challenging situation. He's going to be 70 years old. How many years does he have left? We just need to contain him for a decade.
Time was on our side.
Contain him for more decade. That's my best idea. Contain him for a decade.
The thing I have the most trouble with is if you look at the media portrayal of this. So I said last week when we had this successful counteroffensive that maybe we'll get what we want, which is Russian morale collapses and they just tuck their tail between their legs and go back to Moscow. Or maybe the Russians really do see this war as existential for them. Putin sees it as existential for himself, and he escalates. Well, what happened this week? We went up a rung on the escalatory ladder. Basically, Putin drew down 300,000 more troops, and he's basically indicated his willingness to use tactical nukes, and he's basically said, I'm not bluffing. So now, what is the reaction in the American press? He must be bluffing.
I mean,
that basically is the reaction. And look, I don't know how you know that. In poker, what do we do when someone we put them on a range? It's called a hand range, right?
Yes.
You can't possibly know exactly what they're going to do or what cards they're holding. So you put them on a range of possible hands, and then you evaluate the story in light of their past actions. What do they do before the flop, on the flop? And you basically come to an assessment of what is likely based on their story. Now, take Putin's story. Like Freeberg said, he's never backed down in his life from anything. He has said this war is existential. He basically threatened to invade, and so he did. I mean, I don't know how you can immediately jump to the conclusion this is just a bluff. Maybe it is, but
it could still be. It could still be a bluff. But then, to your point, the range of outcomes does include shoving on the river, moving all in.
He could move all in. I mean, he's a KGB agent. Do you want to play poker with a KGB agent with nukes? It's
right. And so, Jason, you've said throughout this guy's a madman. Well, exactly. I mean, personally, I think he's more like a ruthless mafia boss than a madman. But let's say you're right that he is a madman. What is the story about what we're doing that makes sense if he is a madman? Why would we want to basically back him into a corner like that? Why wouldn't we give him the golden off-ramp? And by the way, just on this idea that no one would ever use tactical nukes, let me just give you 3 data points. First of all, we use them. We dropped 2 atomic bombs on Japan to end World War II. We could have won that war without doing it, but we didn't want to lose the troops.
Well, no, wait, those weren't tactical nukes. Those are
They were tactical nuke-sized atomic bombs. Number 2, MacArthur wanted to use 20 to 30 atomic bombs to end the Korean War. He had a whole plan. Truman fired him. He thought he basically had jumped the shark. But MacArthur was the most respected and admired American in 1950. And the reason why Truman could not run for re-election is because he fired MacArthur. MacArthur would have used basically the equivalent of tactical nukes to win the Korean War. And his plan to prevent China from reinvading from the north was to irradiate the border so completely that Chinese troops could not go through it.
Keep in mind, there wasn't as many nukes at the time, so we weren't up against 9 different nuclear-enabled countries. But yes,
I understand, but we had an American commander, a head of our military, who was willing to use nukes to win a war. So this idea that he wouldn't, I mean, we've been willing to do that. And the third example is obviously the Cuban Missile Crisis. All of Kennedy's military advisors were willing to use nukes. I mean, and the best thing Kennedy did was not listen to his military advisors. They were all super hawkish. And Kennedy, what did he do? He looked for a way out. He looked for a compromise. He sent Bobby Kennedy to go cut a secret deal with the Russians where Kennedy agreed to pull our Jupiter missiles out of Turkey if the Russians would pull their missiles out of Cuba. And then he lied to the American public about it because he didn't want to be perceived as backing down. But that's the kind of, flexibility and mental acuity that I think you would need in a nuclear showdown to avoid a catastrophe. If things do escalate to the point of a nuclear showdown, do we believe that we have leadership on the level of a Jack Kennedy or a Bobby Kennedy who can basically show the flexibility and adaptability to cut a deal to basically pull us back from the brink?
Yeah, it doesn't seem like that.
What was Biden's response? It was he gave this speech to the United Nations in response to Putin. And it's more of the same. It's more of this, as I call it, the Abe Simpson speech. It's old man yelling at the cloud. I mean, he's basically just yelling at a teleprompter. Now, I think the strategically smart play would have been to say, listen, Putin, you said that you want the people of Ukraine to decide where these territories go. Okay, we can hold a referendum, but we want it administered by the United Nations so it'll have some credibility behind it. I mean, why not throw that out there as a potential way to get diplomacy started.
It felt like at the end of last year, you guys remember, I thought like conflict was likely this year. I don't think that the conditions that I was referencing have really gotten better. I think they've gotten worse. And that's why I think we all talk about this in a rational way, meaning like how the conscious mind would, debate the merits and challenges and risks of having a golden bridge or continuing conflict. But if you look historically, the US has often been in the middle of or at the tail end of some either recessionary cycle or inflationary cycle when conflict escalated externally.
Wag the dog you're referring to?
I don't know if I would call it that, but I think that there is an innate human anxiety when things aren't going well. You feel like you have to do something about it, and you're either going to have internal conflict or external conflict as a result to try and resolve. When things are going great, the economy is booming, you don't enter a war. You don't start a conflict with a nation when people are happy at home, when your constituents and the unemployment rate is low and wage growth is high, the economy is growing.
Are you referring to the United States or Russia in this case?
I'm referring to the U.S. And I think,
I know. I was just curious if you were
coming out of COVID and coming out of the big question marks that loomed over our economy at the end of last year around inflation, economic growth, interest rates and the effect. And now we're in the middle of the turmoil. Markets are down 30%, and in some cases 70 to 80% for high growth markets. There's an inevitability now that unemployment is going to rise. There is an inevitability now that the economy is going to contract. Leadership is more likely in that scenario to find an outlet, to find a place of conflict. And I don't think it's a conscious decision.
Explain why in this theory. Explain why.
Wag the dog.
Understand the concept.
Is that what you're saying, Freeberg? Wag the dog?
Yeah.
I don't think it's a conscious decision. I don't think that it's like, hey, let's go start a war with Russia because the economy is bad. I think it's this anxiety, the economy is bad, and there's not a lot we can do about it. And over here, on the other hand, there's a problem and there's something we can do about it. We can build strength and we can build integrity and we can build support and we can get people to get behind something together. And we can get something to create a driving mechanism to achieve something big.
Like a distraction, you're saying, yeah.
Yeah, and I don't think that psychology is as simple as a distraction or a wag the dog or, hey, it's not even as simple as the military-industrial complex will see revenue growth and wage growth, and that'll drive the economy. But I think all those things together are true. And I think in whole, we are more likely to want to pursue conflict right now than we were even a year ago.
You buy any of that, Chamath?
I think he's more right than wrong. I think that when things aren't easy, you need to find sort of distractions essentially to get people to focus on other things so that the core problem isn't as obvious. We have in the United States, I think.
Yeah, let's go create another problem that's solvable.
Yeah, I think the best way that I can describe this is I see it as institutional rot. And the more that we're left to our own devices, that amount of institutional decay becomes more and more obvious. Our governments don't work the way that they should. Our state assemblies are basically co-opted by special interests. The federal institutions we rely on to make rules are not that great. Enormous amounts of money get wasted every day. And as more and more people become aware of these things, the trend is just so bad. Civic engagement goes down. Everything just gets worse. And so when you take that, and then on top of that, you sit it on a poor economy, that is a real powder keg, I think. And so folks I think if you're a politician, it's easier to kind of go and point to Taiwan and say, we're going to go and defend these folks if there's a war, point to Russia and say this, point to all these other things. Whether it's implicit, as Freeberg says, or it's more explicit of a strategy, I don't know. But the underlying cause is the same, which is that if the foundation of the house is not strong and you're not sure what to do to fix it, or you don't have the courage to fix it, the better strategic alternative is to distract and talk about your neighbor's house.
Coming out of the financial crisis in 2008, 2009, Obama recommitted to Afghanistan and sent 17,000 troops to Afghanistan in early 2009 when he took office. We entered the Persian Gulf with the Gulf War in 1991, coming out of the Great Recession, or the mild recession, 1990 to 1991. 2000-2001 .com crash. We obviously entered Iraq.
Yeah, well, that was post 9/11. Post 9/11,
but it was also
But
it was also in the midst of a recession and coming out of the.
Yeah, but that one was clearly a reaction. Sachs, you buy this? Do you think this is a wag the dog or?
And by the way, you can do the same. You can do the same analysis on the time we entered the Korean War and the time we entered the Vietnam War. They were both tied to recessions, and so I don't know how explicit this action and behavior is, but I just think there's some data to it.
There was a study that just came out by Tufts University on American military interventions throughout American history. And what they found was that we had the least in the period before the Cold War. Then the second most was during the Cold War. But actually the most hyperactive period of American military interventions was post-Cold War. So since the unipolar moment, even though it's been the safest period for America, right? We haven't
explain unipolar for people who don't know. Yeah.
Just that there's only one great power in the system. Before, during the Cold War, it was a bipolar world, where it was basically America versus the Soviet Union, and you had basically had the NATO and the Western Alliance, and the so-called free world, and then
perceived check and balance.
You'd have the Warsaw Pact on the other side.
And now we have unipolar moving to bipolar.
Well, it was we were unipolar for a couple of decades, but now we're moving towards multipolar, or at least bipolar with China.
Yeah. Multipolar would be maybe including India,
Brazil, China.
In the future.
Yeah.
But so the irony is that the safer America has become, the more we've gotten militarily involved overseas. And part of that is because there's no great power in the system to oppose us. But it's also gotten us in a lot of trouble. I mean, all of these wars in the Middle East that cost us something like $8 trillion. Another survey, Cost of War study, the direct number of deaths from these wars, from the war on terror, was over 1 million lives lost, $8 trillion. And that doesn't even include the excess mortality caused by the destruction of infrastructure, wastewater treatment, famine, all that kind of stuff, which could be as high as 5 million.
And you know the crazy part about that, Sachs? That $8 trillion, if we had deployed that in energy independence, solar, nuclear, whatever, the whole reason to be in the Middle East was oil and energy. And we could have just deployed that to be energy independent in the West and not had all of this pain.
Not the whole reason. I think the reason to be in Afghanistan was to kill Osama
with the exception of 9/11 and maybe.
But we could have done that without taking over the whole country and gone on this 20-year nation.
That could have been done very strategically.
I mean, actually, that was really proven well, first of all, we did kill bin Laden in Pakistan with just a raid by the SEALs, infiltration. So we didn't need to occupy that country. And then more recently, we finally got Zawahiri in Afghanistan using a drone after we left the country. So what the hell do we need to be there for 20 years when we could kill these guys using drones and, a helicopter team? Yeah.
This is where we needed to have an adversary who could check our power. It would have been healthier, is I guess the premise to the Tufts study.
Right. But look, I think to Freeberg's point, do we become more militaristic when things aren't going well at home? I don't know, but it feels to me like just in general over the last 30 years, we've become hyper militaristic. The use of military force is typically the first option, and we resort to it too quickly, and we don't use diplomacy enough. And you can see that in just the number of lives lost, the failure of these wars, and the enormous deficit we're running.
As you know, Sachs, I can't stand Trump. The two things he got right, no wars, and he was the dictator whisperer. That guy knew how to talk to a dictator. Whether it was North Korea, China, Russia, he just knew how to bond with them. It was like a superpower for him. Okay, we have 3 directions to go.
If that keeps us out of war, it's great,
I mean, it's literally his only saving grace. All right,